Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. It was 1912. The year the locals claimed strange things happened deep in the mountains, but I never believed their tales. I had just started my job as a park ranger, eager to leave my war days behind and embrace the quiet of the forest. My name is William Burns, a former soldier with too many memories and too few people who cared to hear them. So, when I got this job, I thought it would be a peaceful escape. I was wrong. The day started like any other, with the first light of dawn barely touching the thick canopy overhead. My dog, Jack, and I set out on our usual patrol, the path winding through dense trees and a sea of mist that covered everything like a thin blanket. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, and I could hear nothing but the soft crunch of leaves under my boots and the gentle panting of Jack by my side. It was cold, colder than usual for early spring, but I shook it off as just another mountain quirk. Jack was a good companion, loyal and sharp. He was an old dog by then, with a gray muzzle and a limp from a run-in with a cougar years back. But he was brave. The locals called him the old guardian of the mountain, which always made me laugh because Jack was more likely to roll over and beg for a belly rub than scare anything off. But he was good company, especially on those lonely, quiet mornings. The silence of the morning was comforting until it wasn't. I'd gotten used to the sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and distant creaks, but today the woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the scampering of small animals. I shrugged it off, but the silence gnawed at me. Jack noticed it too. His ears perked, and his head tilted to the side, as if listening for something just out of reach. I patted his back and mumbled something about the weather. But in truth, I felt uneasy. About an hour into our patrol, I noticed something strange. Deep, almost claw-like grooves were etched into the trunk of a massive tree. They weren't the marks of any animal I knew, not a bear, not a cougar. These cuts were long, too deep, and too straight, almost deliberate, like someone had carved them with a sharp tool. The bark was torn, as if the tree had been hurt. I crouched down to get a closer look, and Jack let out a low growl. His eyes were fixed on something further down the trail, but when I looked, I saw nothing but thick fog rolling in, swallowing the path ahead. The fog was sudden, like it had been waiting just out of sight and had finally decided to make its move. It was thick, heavy, and cold. Cold enough that I could see my breath hanging in the air, even though it wasn't winter. "Easy, boy," I whispered. But Jack didn't relax. Instead, he backed up, his eyes darting left and right, his ears pinned back. I had never seen him like that. He was tense, scared even. That's when I felt it too. Something was off. The fog settled around us, muting the world. I tried to call out, to hear my own voice cut through the mist, but my words felt swallowed, dampened by that heavy, unnatural quiet. I turned to Jack, who was now whimpering, a sound I hadn't heard since he was a pup. Then I heard it, a faint voice, distant but clear, calling my name. William. It was soft like a whisper carried by the wind, but there was no wind. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo all around, bouncing off the trees, drifting through the fog. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a feeling I hadn't felt since the trenches. William? It was my name, but there was something wrong about the way it sounded. It was almost right, but not quite, like someone who had practiced saying it, but hadn't gotten it right. I grabbed Jack's collar, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath my cold fingers, grounding myself. As we stood there, the fog shifted, and I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, a figure that seemed to glide rather than walk. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated, stretching out as if searching, reaching. I could barely make out any details, just the shape of something that didn't belong, something that moved too smoothly, too silently. Jack growled, but this time he didn't wait for my command. He lunged forward, barking, teeth bared, his fur standing on end. I tried to hold him back, but he pulled away, charging into the mist. His barks echoed, growing fainter as he disappeared into the thick fog. "Jack! Jack, come back!" I shouted, but my voice felt like it was swallowed, as if the fog itself was consuming the sound. I was alone now, surrounded by the cold mist and the unsettling silence. And then I saw it again, those eyes, two faintly glowing orbs in the fog, watching me. They were the color of dying embers, a dull, reddish glow that cut through the mist, staring right into me. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my neck, my body frozen in place. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. The creature, the thing, moved closer, the fog seeming to part around it, revealing limbs that were far too long, almost skeletal, with claws that glinted even in the dim light. Its face was nothing but shadows, save for those burning eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch wide, too wide, in an unnatural grin. "William." The voice came again, this time closer, more mocking, as if it were playing with me. It knew my name, but it didn't belong to anyone I knew. It sounded almost human, but hollow, like something trying to remember how humans spoke. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the damp leaves, my heart thundering in my chest. I could hear something behind me, a soft scraping, like claws dragging through dirt, moving faster than any human could. I reached the edge of the trail, where a steep, icy slope led down into a rocky valley. I could barely make out the terrain through the fog, but I had no choice. I scrambled down, sliding and stumbling, cutting my hands on the rocks, but I didn't stop. The scraping sound grew louder, closing in, relentless. Suddenly, I heard Jack barking from somewhere ahead, his voice strong and urgent. He was alive, and he was calling to me. I pushed myself harder, following his barks through the mist, my vision blurred by the sweat and tears streaming down my face. I made it to the bottom, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Jack was there, waiting for me, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned, expecting to see the creature right on my heels, but there was nothing. Only fog and silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that maybe the thing had given up. But then Jack's ears went flat, and he started to growl. His gaze locked on something just beyond my sight. I could feel it too, a presence, a weight in the air, something watching, waiting. I heard a low, guttural sound, a growl that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, reverberating, filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. Jack looked back at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, a kind of acceptance, like he knew what was coming. Before I could stop him, Jack charged into the fog, barking and growling, disappearing into the mist. I shouted his name, but he didn't turn back. All I heard was the sound of his final howl, a desperate, defiant cry that echoed through the trees, fading into silence. I waited, hoping, praying that he would come back, but the fog lifted and he was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign of the creature, nothing but the eerie quiet of the forest. I stumbled back to the station hours later, my clothes torn, my hands bloody, my mind racing with memories I couldn't shake. When I told the locals, they listened with solemn faces, nodding knowingly. They spoke of the mountain phantom, a spirit they claimed appeared every decade, a creature that wandered the woods, seeking lost souls. I never saw Jack again, but I still hear his bark sometimes, echoing through the fog on quiet mornings. And every spring, when the mist rolls in thick and silent, I feel those eyes watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. If you thought that last story was chilling, the next one is even more haunting. I never expected my time as a park ranger to turn into a horror story, but that's exactly what happened in the summer of 1944. The world was consumed by the chaos of World War II, but in the untouched wilderness of the riverside, I found a strange sense of calm. My name is Evelyn Hart, a former medic who had lost my younger brother, Michael, to the war. After his death, I sought solace in the only place that had ever made me feel safe. The vast, serene river that stretched through the thick woods. On that morning, the sun peeked over the horizon, casting golden rays that danced upon the surface of the water. The river sparkled like diamonds scattered across a blue blanket, and the soft sounds of nature filled my ears. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil I felt inside. I set up my small camp and prepared to patrol the area. My heart was heavy with memories, but being outdoors helped me forget, if only for a little while. The first signs of something strange emerged during my morning rounds. I noticed half-eaten fish floating along the bank, their scales reflecting the sunlight in a ghastly way. The scene was unsettling, but I brushed it off, attributing it to a predator or a natural occurrence. As I walked along the shore, a foul, sulfurous smell began to permeate the air, making me wrinkle my nose. I looked around, my instincts kicking in. Something didn't feel right. Then I spotted something else that sent a chill down my spine. Footprints on the sandy riverbank, large and oddly shaped. They resembled human footprints, but ended in claw-like toes, as if something had stepped out of the river and onto the shore. My heart raced. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination, but the tracks were unmistakable. Just a trick of the light, I muttered to myself, forcing my thoughts back to the routine of the day. I climbed into my small boat and paddled along the river, scanning the water for signs of trouble. The water rocked gently beneath me, but I felt an odd disturbance, something unseen lurking beneath the surface. The further I went, the more my unease grew, and the fish I spotted earlier began to seem like a bad omen. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple, a strange sound reached my ears, a soft, haunting melody that floated across the water. At first I thought it might be the wind, but as I strained to listen, it became clear. It was a woman's voice, sweet yet eerie. It echoed through the trees, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. I paddled toward the sound, a mixture of curiosity and dread filling my chest. My heart beat faster, the song growing louder, more insistent, wrapping around me like a shroud. I strained my eyes, searching for the source. There, across the river, I saw her. A figure stood just at the water's edge, half submerged, her hair flowing like seaweed. Her face shimmered like the surface of the river, shifting and changing, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I couldn't look away. It was as if she were calling to me, her voice weaving through my thoughts, pulling me closer, promising something I couldn't understand. "Evelyn," she sang, her voice sweet and melodic, yet laced with an undertone of something darker. I felt an overwhelming desire to wade into the water, to let the coolness envelop me, to give in to her call. It felt wrong, but I couldn't help myself. I was mesmerized, teetering on the edge of reason. As I fought against the urge to step into the river, I dug my nails into the muddy bank, desperate to ground myself. The river's water sparkled, enticing and seductive, and the figure in the water began to inch closer, her haunting song filling my ears, drowning out all sense of reality. "Come to me, Evelyn," she crooned, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "You belong with me, forever." I realized then that this was no ordinary woman. The tales I had heard from the locals flooded back to me. The stories of the siren that lured men to their deaths, drowning them in the river's depths. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let her win. I remembered the broken mirror I kept in my pack, a keepsake from Michael. It was a small piece, cracked but still reflecting light. With trembling hands, I pulled it out, hoping it would serve as my salvation. I angled it toward the figure, the sunlight catching the shards and creating a blinding glare. The siren recoiled, her eyes narrowing against the light. The melody faltered, turning into a low growl that echoed across the water. "No, you cannot escape," she hissed, her form warping and twisting, revealing more of her grotesque features. Her once beautiful face became a mask of fury, hollow eyes burning with anger. I didn't wait. I pushed myself away from the bank, scrambling back into my boat, frantically paddling away. The water churned behind me, and I could hear her screams mingling with the sound of rushing water. It was chaos, a primal roar of fury that threatened to swallow me whole. I didn't stop until I reached the shore, the riverbank finally giving me solid ground. Breathless and shaking, I looked back. The river was still again, the surface calm and unassuming. But I knew better. I had felt her presence, the darkness that lurked beneath the tranquil facade. Days passed, but I could never shake the melody from my mind. The haunting tune echoed in my dreams, pulling me back to the river, to the siren. I reported the strange occurrences to my supervisor, but he merely dismissed them as tales spun by the locals to scare tourists. I knew what I had seen. I had faced something beyond explanation. I left the river behind, seeking refuge in the depths of the forest, but the siren's song haunted me wherever I went. Even in the quietest moments, when I thought I was alone, I would hear it faintly in the wind, a whisper that slithered through the trees. I returned home, but the shadows followed me, creeping into my dreams, luring me back to the river's edge. I had escaped her clutches, but the siren's call lingered, an echo of what I had encountered. I often wondered if I would ever be free of her haunting melody, or if she would find a way to call me back. One night, as I lay in bed, I woke suddenly, the sound of my name echoing through the room. It was soft at first, then grew louder, swirling around me. My heart raced as I sat up, the melody unmistakable. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see her waiting, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it seeped in, a lullaby that promised peace, tempting me to return to the river. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. What if I hadn't really left? What if she was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to draw me back into her depths? I didn't know. I still don't. The river still calls to me, a siren song I can never forget, an unanswered question that lingers in the back of my mind. And as I sit here, recalling that fateful summer, I can't help but wonder, am I truly safe, or is she still waiting, hidden just below the surface, ready to lure me back into her grasp? Just when you think it can't get worse, this next story proves you wrong. You know, there are stories people tell about the wilderness, especially in places like Yellowstone, where the land is so vast that even the sky seems to disappear into it. I never thought much of those stories. I'd been working as a park ranger for nearly a decade by the time I took that transfer out to Yellowstone. I'd seen all sorts of strange things, sure, but they'd always had explanations. Elk, bear, wolves. They're all around you out here, but none of them had ever spooked me. That winter, I was stationed in a remote part of the park, a place where few visitors ventured, especially in the colder months. It was supposed to be a fresh start for me after the divorce. I'd convinced myself that being alone, surrounded by snow and trees and quiet, would give me peace. That's what I thought, at least, as I settled into my routine. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd needed. I spent my days checking trails, monitoring wildlife, making sure everything was as it should be. Snow had begun to fall steadily, turning the world outside into a quiet, white landscape. At night, I'd sit in the warmth of my little cabin, a mug of coffee in my hand, listening to the crackle of the wood stove. It was peaceful, almost eerily so. But then, one evening, something changed. I'd just finished my rounds and was heading back to the cabin when I saw something odd in the snow. At first, I thought it was just animal tracks. Elk, maybe, or a large deer. But as I looked closer, something didn't seem right. The tracks were enormous, larger than any elk I'd ever seen. They started near the edge of the clearing, leading deeper into the trees, but halfway across the field, they simply stopped. Just vanished, like whatever had made them had taken off into the sky. I stood there for a while, looking around, trying to make sense of it. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I scanned the tree line, half expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the soft, silent snowfall and the empty woods stretching out before me. I shook it off, chalking it up to snowdrift or the wind. Besides, I'd seen stranger things out here that could be explained. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that being out here alone was bound to make me jumpy. I ignored it, finished my coffee, and went to bed. The next day, I found more of those strange tracks. They were deeper this time, as if something heavy had trudged through, and they led from the tree line toward the cabin before vanishing again. I spent a good hour trying to track them, but they always disappeared after a few yards. I couldn't find any signs of where they came from or where they went, as if whatever was making them was stepping in and out of reality itself. That night, I heard the first of the sounds. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, when I was jolted awake by a loud snapping noise, like a tree branch breaking under tremendous weight. I sat up, heart pounding, listening as the sound echoed through the night. Then there was silence. I waited, straining to hear anything more, but the only sound was the wind howling outside, whistling through the trees like it was carrying some message I couldn't understand. The next morning, I went out to investigate, half expecting to find a fallen branch or some signs of what had caused the noise. But there was nothing. Everything was still, untouched, as if I'd dreamed the whole thing. Over the next few days, the sounds continued. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, almost like voices carried on the wind. Other times, it was that same snapping sound, coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing, always in the dead of night. And then, just as suddenly, it would stop. I began to dread the nights, lying awake, listening for that awful sound, waiting for it to come closer. One night, the snapping sounds were followed by a low, rumbling growl, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through my bones. I leapt out of bed, grabbed my flashlight and rifle, and stepped outside. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight as I scanned the trees. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an elk, but as the beam of my flashlight settled on the creature, I realized something was terribly, horribly wrong. It was enormous, towering over any elk I'd ever seen, its matted fur hanging in thick clumps from its body. But what struck me the most were its eyes. Well, where its eyes should have been. They were just empty, dark sockets, like twin voids staring right through me. Its head was twisted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken and then forced back into place. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The creature took a step toward me, its hooves crunching in the snow, and I could feel its gaze even without eyes. It was like it was sizing me up, deciding what to do with me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and slipped back into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I found myself pacing the cabin, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a half-asleep hallucination. But deep down I knew it was real. I could still feel its gaze, lingering like a shadow. The following night, it returned. This time, I saw it circling the cabin, just at the edge of the clearing. I could hear the snapping sounds again, closer than ever, as if it was taunting me. I knew I couldn't stay here. I packed a bag, threw on my coat, and prepared to make a run for the station, even though it was a good few miles away. As I stepped outside, I could see the creature waiting in the distance, half hidden in the shadows, its head cocked to one side, those empty sockets trained on me. I bolted, my boots crunching through the snow as I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't look back, not once, but I could feel it following me, its presence pressing down on me, filling the silence with an unbearable weight. When I finally stumbled into the station, breathless and trembling, I told the others what I'd seen. They laughed it off, saying I'd been out there too long, that isolation could play tricks on the mind. But I knew the truth. I'd seen it, felt it, and I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. I never went back to that part of the park. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about those empty sockets and that twisted, broken head. People say Yellowstone is a place of beauty, but I know better. I know there are things out there, things we're not meant to understand, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And if you're ever out there, alone in the snow, listen carefully. You might just hear it too. Brace yourself, because the real terror begins with our next tale. I don't know if anyone will believe this. I still have trouble believing it myself. And I was there. The events I'm about to recount are the kind of story that could easily be brushed off as an overactive imagination or a tale made up for campfires. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll take those memories to my grave. It all started as an ordinary trip, part of my job as a forest ranger. I'm Rebecca Hall, and I've been working as a ranger in the Appalachians for almost a decade. The mountains have always been a second home to me. I know their sounds, their shadows, and every trail like the back of my hand. I've dealt with more wild animals than I can count, and had my share of close encounters. So, when a nearby university asked if I could guide a group of students on a spelunking expedition, I didn't think twice. The night before the trip, I prepared my gear as usual. The students were excited about the adventure, and their chatter brought a warm, familiar feeling. It was a warm evening, a gentle breeze brushing through the trees, rustling the leaves in a way that usually calmed me. But this time there was something off. Maybe it was how quiet the woods had been recently, or the occasional sensation of being watched that I'd been shrugging off. I brushed it aside, figuring it was just my nerves about keeping a group of college kids safe. The following morning, I met with the students, briefed them, and we started the hike to a cave I'd explored many times before. It was deep enough to satisfy their thirst for adventure, but safe enough for my peace of mind. The hike was uneventful, and we arrived at the cave entrance just as a low fog began to settle around us. We turned on our headlamps, checked our gear, and filed into the cave one by one. It didn't take long before we started noticing strange things. About 15 minutes in, one of the students, Danny, pointed out some odd claw marks on the walls. They were deep, as if something had dragged its nails through solid rock. I knew bears sometimes found their way into caves, especially during the colder months, and I reassured the group that it was probably old bear marks. Still, something about those marks looked different, like they were older than anything I'd seen and somehow sharper, too precise for any animal I knew. The group seemed fine, so we continued deeper into the cave. But then, a scream echoed through the space, making everyone jump. I spun around to find Kelly, one of the students, standing frozen with wide eyes, clutching something in her hand. I moved closer and saw she was holding a bone, small but with strange carvings etched into it, symbols I didn't recognize. The bone looked too clean, almost as if it had been placed there recently, like some kind of warning. I told Kelly to leave it behind, and we continued on, trying to laugh off the tension. But the atmosphere had changed. It felt heavier, almost oppressive. A few minutes later, we hit a narrow passage that required us to crawl single file. I went first, shining my flashlight ahead to ensure it was safe. But as we moved deeper, my light began to flicker. I tapped it, hoping it was just a loose battery, but it went out completely. At that moment, I was engulfed in complete darkness. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. I radioed the students to stay calm and wait while I checked my spare flashlight. But as I did, I heard something. A shuffling sound, like something was moving along the walls. My heart pounded as I managed to get the spare light working. I turned it on and scanned the passage, but there was nothing there. I wanted to tell myself it was just the wind echoing through the cave, but we were too deep for that. I pushed it aside, calling for the students to move forward. I didn't want to scare them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we pressed on, the air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Suddenly, a student at the back of the group, Tim, screamed. I whipped around to see him stumbling back, his face pale. Eyes, he whispered. I saw red eyes watching us. I scanned the walls, trying to see what he had seen, but there was nothing there. I tried to calm him down, telling him it was just the reflection of his own light, but I could see he didn't believe me. And to be honest, I didn't believe myself. We kept moving, everyone now on edge. Then, as we turned a corner, my flashlight flickered again. I slapped it, hoping it would stay on, but it went dark. This time, before I could pull out my spare, I saw them. Two red, glowing eyes staring at us from the shadows, barely visible in the faint light from the students' headlamps. They were too high to be an animal, and they didn't blink. They just stared. I felt a chill run down my spine. I urged the students to stay quiet and to keep their lights steady on the path ahead. I hoped that whatever it was would leave us alone, but the eyes followed us, darting from wall to wall, always just out of reach. Then it stepped into the light. It was tall, pale, almost translucent, with skin stretched thin over long, sinewy limbs. Its fingers were elongated, ending in sharp, claw-like nails that scraped against the rock as it moved. Its face was gaunt, its eyes a piercing red that seemed to glow in the darkness, fixed directly on us. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I knew I had to get the students out of there. I reached for the flare in my pack, hoping the light would be enough to drive it back. With a quick motion, I struck the flare, filling the cave with a harsh red glow. The creature hissed, recoiling slightly, but it didn't retreat. I shouted for the students to run, to get out of the cave, and not look back. The students scrambled, their footsteps echoing through the narrow passages. I stayed back, holding the flare between myself and the creature, backing away slowly. It followed, inching closer with each step, its red eyes never leaving mine. I could feel its hunger, its intent, like it was studying me, deciding whether I was worth the effort. Then, without warning, it lunged. I threw the flare at it, watching as it flinched and shrieked, the sound echoing off the cave walls. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as I sprinted through the darkness. I could hear it behind me, its claws scraping against the rock, getting closer and closer. Somehow, I made it to the cave entrance, gasping for air as I stumbled out into the daylight. 2 students had already made it out, but 3 were missing. I called their names, my voice hoarse, but there was no answer. The locals who heard our screams came running, and they knew. They didn't ask questions, just gave each other a look and whispered among themselves. Later, I heard them talking about the cave dweller, an old legend passed down through generations. They said it was something that lived deep in the mountains, something that fed on those who wandered too far, who dared to disturb its home. I never went back into that cave. For months after, hikers reported seeing red eyes in the forest, watching from a distance, disappearing when approached. No one found any trace of the missing students. Some say they got lost, others say they're still down there, somewhere in the dark. As for me, I try not to think about it, but every now and then, when I close my eyes, I see those red eyes staring back at me, and I remember the feeling of being watched, hunted, deep in the heart of the mountains. And I wonder if someday it will come looking for me. Thought that was enough horror for one night? Then you're not ready for what's next. I'm not sure if you'll believe this, but I'm telling it exactly the way I remember it. I was a park ranger in Alaska for over 15 years, and I've seen all kinds of strange things, things that make most folks' skin crawl. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that February night. The day had started like any other, quiet, cold, and uneventful. Alaska in February usually meant freezing temperatures, snowdrifts piled high, and long, dark nights that felt like they'd never end. That evening, though, something felt off. It was unusually warm and thick, heavy fog rolled in around dusk. I'd never seen anything like it. The air felt thick and strange, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. My shift that night had me patrolling the outer edge of a remote trail just outside the park's boundary, close to an old hiking path barely anyone used anymore. It wasn't a popular spot, too dense with trees and too far from the main trails. Most folks didn't wander this far, especially not in the middle of winter. The fog was so thick, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My flashlight felt useless, swallowed up by the haze as if fighting against some invisible force. I could only make out vague shadows of trees looming around me, twisting and merging in the fog. Even for someone who'd spent years in the wilderness, the whole scene felt surreal and unnerving. I checked my radio, feeling the silence weigh on me as I clicked it on. A few minutes later, I noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading off the trail. They were big, far bigger than any human footprint I'd ever seen, and they didn't look like bear or wolf tracks either. I'd been a ranger long enough to know the usual animal prints around these parts, but this was different. It was something else entirely. I tried the radio again, hoping to report the strange tracks, but all I got was static. The signal was completely jammed, which was odd because even in remote areas, we could usually catch at least a faint signal. It was as if something was interfering with it. The silence felt suffocating, and in that moment, I realized I felt something else. I felt watched. And then I heard it, a faint whistling sound, distant but clear. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, but there was something chilling about it. It didn't belong. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears, trying to make out where it was coming from. But the fog was so thick, so heavy, it was impossible to tell. Every sound felt like it was coming from every direction. A creeping dread settled over me. My instincts told me to turn back, to run, to put as much distance between myself and that sound as possible. But something else, a mixture of curiosity and duty, compelled me to stay. I took a few cautious steps forward, following the whistling, my heart pounding in my chest. The whistling grew louder, and then, through the fog, I saw it, a shadow, a figure moving slowly between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that looked too long, like they'd been stretched out. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, gliding more than walking. I turned off my flashlight, hoping the darkness would make me harder to spot. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The figure stopped as if sensing me. It tilted its head, and that's when I saw its face, or rather, the empty, hollow pits where its eyes should have been. Its skin looked rough, almost like tree bark, blending seamlessly with the forest around it. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, me hiding in the shadows, and it watching. Then, without a sound, it started moving again, but this time it was heading straight for me. My hands were shaking as I reached for my emergency flare. I only had one, and it was my last resort, but I knew I had no other choice. With a trembling hand, I struck it, and the flare burst to life, filling the fog with an intense red light. The creature recoiled, its face twisting in a way no human face could. In that moment, I saw it clearly. Its hollow eyes, the jagged bark-like texture of its skin, and its mouth, a wide, unnatural slit that seemed to stretch all the way across its face. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the fog. I didn't wait. I ran, my boots pounding against the muddy ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow eyes right behind me. But there was nothing, only the thick, endless fog. When I finally stumbled back to the ranger station, I was drenched in sweat and shaking all over. I managed to call in my team, barely able to get the words out. But by the time we returned to the trail with more lights and backup, there was nothing. The fog had lifted, the forest was silent, and the strange footprints had disappeared without a trace. They wrote it off as exhaustion or stress, said I was imagining things. But I know what I saw. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, or the sound of that eerie whistling. And sometimes late at night when the forest is quiet and the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. The faint, haunting melody calling to me from the fog. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. And part of me knows that if I ever follow that sound again, I might not be lucky enough to come back. If you asked anyone who worked out in the Everglades, they'd tell you, we don't scare easy. It's a tough place, and you get used to the way nature plays tricks on you. A shadow moving through the trees, a splash that seems too close, things that would rattle most people are just part of life for a park ranger. I thought I was ready for anything, but I'm not so sure anymore. I was assigned to Dawn Patrol that morning in 2002, back when I was still pretty new to the job. The Everglades were my life, a place I knew better than any other, and I felt at home there, in the way only a handful of people ever do. The swamp was waking up slowly around me, birds calling to each other, frogs croaking, and the hum of insects buzzing in the heavy air. That morning, though, something was off. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. The usual sound seemed muffled, and every crunch of my boots against the wet ground echoed in an odd, lonely way. It started with a strange feeling, a sense that something was watching me. I know, it sounds cliché, but if you've ever felt it, you'd know how unsettling it can be, especially when you're miles from the nearest road, surrounded by miles of swamp. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a raccoon eyeing me from the shadows. My GPS was giving me issues too. It kept losing its signal, and at one point, it outright died on me. Just flashed a black screen and refused to turn back on. I'd been patrolling these grounds long enough to know my way, so I wasn't exactly worried. But as I walked further, something strange caught my eye, an odd shape up ahead. It was a heron, lying on the ground, stiff and unmoving. I'd seen dead birds before, but this one was different. Its head was missing, and the wound was fresh. I remember standing there for a second, staring, the smell of rot thick in the air. It was almost like the swamp was holding on to that smell, letting it sink in. The smell got worse as I walked on, and the air felt heavier. I don't know how to explain it. I'd been out there during thunderstorms, under scorching sun, and even at night with just my flashlight, but this was different. It felt as if the swamp was closing in on me. And then I saw it, the water rippling in a way that wasn't natural. There was no breeze, no gator in sight, but the water was moving like something was slithering just below the surface. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, but I knew better. My hand moved to my flare gun, gripping it tightly, my eyes fixed on the water. I thought I'd imagined it, but then I saw pale hands, fingers long and thin, clawing up through the mud. My heart was in my throat. Whatever it was moving slowly, deliberately. I froze, watching as the thing started to rise. Sunken eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto me from beneath a mass of dripping weeds and muck. Its skin was almost white, stretched tight over bone, and its movements were deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing. The swamp was silent. Not a single bird called, not even a rustle in the leaves. It was just me, and whatever that thing was. I felt a chill run through me as it crept closer. It was then that I realized I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd turned to lead, rooted in place as that thing got closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I raised the flare gun, my hand shaking. It felt like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My finger was on the trigger when it lunged, its fingers reaching out toward me, thin and clawed, caked in muck. I pulled the trigger, the flare lighting up the swamp in an angry red glow, and for a split second, I saw it fully. Those sunken eyes, the way its mouth twisted, almost as if it was smiling. The flare seemed to startle it, and I took that chance to turn and run. I didn't stop, didn't look back. My heart was pounding, my legs burning as I stumbled through the thick mud, scratching my leg against the twisted roots. When I finally made it back to the station, I burst through the door, out of breath, covered in mud and scratches. My colleagues looked at me like I was crazy. No one believed me, of course. Who would? I was the new ranger, and telling a story about some swamp creature wasn't exactly going to boost my credibility. But I know what I saw, and every once in a while, I feel a strange itch on my leg, right where those scratches are, almost like a reminder. A part of me wants to go back, to prove to myself it was real. But some nights, I still hear that heavy silence, that unnatural quiet, and it stops me from ever stepping foot in those parts of the swamp again. And the thing that haunts me the most is that, to this day, no one else has ever seen it. Or if they did, they never came back to tell anyone. The shadows grow darker with every story, and this next one? Pure nightmare fuel. It was the summer of 2010, and I was working as a ranger in the Mojave Desert, covering the night shift. My name's Luis Fernandez, and honestly, I've always loved the desert. The vast, open land, the solitude, the quiet. You could lose yourself out there, find a kind of peace that's rare. I thought I'd seen it all, from blinding dust storms to packs of coyotes in the dead of night. But nothing prepared me for that one evening. I still remember the golden light that bathed the dunes as the sun dipped low. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the shadows were stretching out, reaching across the sand like long fingers. I was on my regular patrol, heading back toward my vehicle after a long trek when I noticed something strange. There was a set of tracks in the sand, weaving back and forth, winding and slithering, unlike anything I'd seen before. The desert has its fair share of strange creatures, but this looked different. It didn't look like animal tracks, more like something heavy had slithered, leaving a thick, wide line trailing across the dunes. I crouched down, trying to get a closer look, and that's when my radio crackled. Usually the radio was reliable, but the signal was cutting in and out, a choppy mess of static and distant voices. I adjusted the dial, trying to tune it, but it was no use. The sun was dropping faster than usual, almost unnaturally quick. The light faded from the sky like someone was dimming a giant switch. The sudden darkness wrapped around me, and the quiet of the desert grew almost suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I kept walking, I saw something. A figure. It was faint, almost blending with the landscape, but it was there, moving smoothly over the sand, about 30 feet ahead of me. The figure was, well, it looked like a person, but there was something wrong. It was completely white, almost glowing, and moved as if it was weightless, like it was floating above the ground. And then, clear as day, I heard it. Luis? It was my name, whispered soft and familiar. I felt a chill rush through my whole body, because the voice wasn't just any voice. It was the voice of my abuela. She had passed away years ago, and there was no way she should have been out there in the middle of the desert. I froze, gripping my flashlight so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I looked around, thinking it was just a trick of the mind, but no one else was there. It was just me and whatever that was. The figure drifted closer, its hollow eyes fixed right on me, its movements impossibly smooth. I raised my flashlight, pointing it right at the thing, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain it. But the light just passed right through, like it was made of mist. My heart was pounding now, and my mouth was dry. Luis? It said my name again, that same soft voice, but this time it sounded like it was right next to me, like it was whispering in my ear. Without thinking, I reached for my weapon. I didn't even know what I was planning to do. My hand just acted on its own. I pulled it out, aimed, and fired. The sound of the shot shattered the silence, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, it would go away. But I'd only hit sand. There was no one there, nothing but an empty desert in front of me. The figure was gone. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and fast, drowning out any other sound. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, running back to where I'd left my vehicle. I stumbled over the dunes, tripping and catching myself, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the sand. When I finally reached the spot, my heart sank. My vehicle, it was gone. There were tracks in the sand, tracks that led out into the desert, stretching toward the horizon, but they just stopped. They didn't fade away naturally like most tracks do. They just ended, like something had picked the vehicle up and carried it off. I stood there, staring out into the darkness, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers for. After a while, I started walking, hoping I could at least make it to the ranger station. I never saw that figure again, but I felt it watching. That strange, uneasy feeling like a pair of hollow eyes were on me, following me, step by step. When I finally made it back, I told my story. People gave me strange looks, polite nods. Most of them thought it was just the heat, or maybe fatigue. They chalked it up to a trick of the mind. But I know what I saw, what I heard. To this day, when I think about the desert at night, I can still hear her voice. If you felt a shiver from that, the next story will leave you completely frozen. I've been a ranger for as long as I can remember. The silence of the mountains, the white expanses stretching for miles. Most people would call it lonely, but for me, it was home. I've seen everything from blizz to wolves prowling too close to campgrounds, but that winter of 2019, well, I still struggle to understand what I saw. It's the sort of thing you tell yourself must have been a hallucination, maybe the cold playing tricks on you. But deep down, I know what I saw. I had been assigned to the remote slopes of a mountain range in Alaska. The cold there is a kind of cold that gnaws at your bones, relentless and sharp. Even on clear days, when the sky looks endless and blue, there's a bite in the air that doesn't let up. That week, it had been especially quiet. No hikers, no climbers, just me, the snow, and the occasional echo of wind through the trees. One night, I was on my usual patrol, making my way up one of the lesser-traveled paths. The snow was deep, almost up to my knees, making each step a bit of a chore. I don't know what it was, but there was an odd tension in the air. Everything seemed still. Too still, even for the wilderness. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a distant roar carried by the wind. I stopped, listening carefully. The sound didn't come again, and I brushed it off as a strange gust. The mountains have a way of making their own music, and sometimes your mind fills in the gaps. I kept moving, but that feeling, like something was watching me, lingered. As I moved further up, I noticed something odd in the snow. Strange grooves, like drag marks, zigzagged across the path. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and began to dig through the snow, just enough to see what lay beneath. Bones, crushed and scattered. They were old, weathered down to brittle bits, and there were far too many of them to belong to just one creature. Some looked animal, others, well, they were small enough to be human. It sent a chill down my spine, and I glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. I didn't want to stick around, so I covered the bones back up and pressed on, hoping to put some distance between myself and whatever had happened there. But that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, a large, hulking figure, barely visible against the snowy backdrop. My heart pounded, but I held still, trying to make out what it was. Maybe a bear? But it moved differently, almost like it was gliding over the snow, leaving no tracks. The figure stopped, and I caught a glimpse of two piercing yellow eyes, locked onto me with an intensity that felt almost human. I started to back away slowly, my heart racing. The creature stepped into the clearing, and I could see it fully now. A massive, furred thing, its coat a strange mixture of whites and grays, almost blending in with the snow. It wasn't a bear, nor a wolf. Its body was lean and muscular, with skin that seemed to shimmer like ice under the moonlight. Then, it let out a low growl, a sound that made my blood run cold. I don't remember much after that. My instincts kicked in, and I ran, stumbling through the snow, barely able to see where I was going. I could hear it behind me, a rhythmic, crunching sound as it moved, too close for comfort. I spotted a cave up ahead, small and shallow, but it was the only shelter in sight. I dove inside, pressing myself against the cold stone as I heard the creature slow its pace outside. For what felt like hours, I stayed there, barely breathing, listening to the soft padding of its paws as it circled the entrance. At one point, it let out a snarl, as if frustrated, and I swore I felt its breath, icy and sharp, wafting through the air. When dawn finally broke, I dared to peek outside. The snow was undisturbed, no tracks, no sign that anything had been there, but I knew better. The bones, the strange marks, the creature, they weren't figments of my imagination. I made it back to camp, shaken and exhausted. I reported what I'd seen, but nobody believed me. They laughed it off, calling it the legend of the ice beast. Something to scare the rookies. But I haven't gone back to those mountains since. And sometimes on cold winter nights I dream of those yellow eyes, watching, waiting. And every time I wake up with the same lingering thought. Some legends aren't just stories. The true horror lies just ahead, in our next story. I've always felt at home in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, where towering pines stretch so high that their tips vanish into a misty sky. This land has a pulse, alive, raw, and ancient, and I'd always found a strange kind of comfort in it. As a ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling these woods, guided only by moonlight and the hum of the wilderness. But one night this year, something happened that I still can't shake. Even now, it's hard to talk about without feeling a chill down my spine. My name is Sam Lynch, and if you're imagining some sort of hardcore wilderness survivalist, well, I guess you wouldn't be too far off. Before I started working as a forest ranger, I was a paramedic. I'd seen things that most people couldn't stomach, things that haunt your dreams long after you've hung up the uniform. I thought nothing could shake me after that. But this was different. It was mid-October, and the forest was draped in its usual autumn cloak. The chill was sharp but familiar, and a fine mist hung in the air, clinging to my jacket as I walked. I was on a routine patrol, checking campsites to make sure no one had left any fires burning or trash lying around. By the time I reached a remote site near one of the old trails, night had fallen completely. The dense canopy above swallowed the last traces of daylight, leaving me alone in the kind of darkness you can't recreate anywhere but deep in the woods. I noticed something strange as soon as I got there. Trees were marked with symbols, odd, twisted shapes carved into the bark. They were faded, like they'd been there for ages, but there was something unsettling about them. I brushed my hand over one of the symbols, trying to decipher its meaning. I'm no expert in folklore, but they looked wrong, unnatural, as if they weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. The air felt thick, charged, and then, as I stood there in that eerie stillness, a foul, metallic scent hit me. At first I thought it was blood, but there was something else mixed in, a rancid, decaying odor that seemed to cling to my nostrils. I felt my pulse quicken, and I took a few steps forward, shining my flashlight around the area. That's when I saw it. A tent lay torn apart, its fabric shredded as if something with sharp claws had ripped through it. The poles were bent, snapped in places. Whatever had done this was strong, too strong to be a bear or a coyote. I bent down to inspect the damage, hoping maybe it was just an accident, but deep down I knew better. As I moved to step away, I heard something. It was soft, barely audible, a series of cracks and snaps, like branches breaking underfoot. I turned quickly, sweeping my flashlight across the trees, but nothing moved. The sounds continued, though, growing louder, closer. It almost sounded like footsteps, but with an odd, dragging quality, as if whatever was making them didn't have the energy or the will to lift its feet completely off the ground. My hand instinctively moved to my flare gun, just in case. I knew the forest well enough to recognize when something didn't belong. But whatever this was, it was keeping just outside the beam of my flashlight, lurking in the shadows, watching. I was about to radio in when my flashlight flickered. Just a small glitch, but it was enough to send my nerves skittering. And then, in that brief moment of darkness, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shape hunched among the trees. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could tell it wasn't human. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and its skin looked stretched, as if it had been pulled taut over its bones. But the worst part was its eyes, empty, black pits that seemed to absorb the light. They locked onto me, unblinking, and I felt a jolt of fear so intense that my whole body went cold. The creature tilted its head, and I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like branches snapping. It was mimicking the sounds of the forest, as if it thought it could lure me closer. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into those empty eyes, but eventually, my survival instincts kicked in. I took a step back, then another, all the while keeping my flashlight trained on the creature. It didn't move, just watched me with that awful, hollow gaze. Finally, when I was a few steps away, I raised my flare gun and fired it directly at the thing's feet. The bright burst of light filled the forest, casting harsh shadows and illuminating the creature fully for the first time. What I saw will stay with me for the rest of my life. Its skin was mottled, stretched over a grotesque, twisted frame, with limbs that seemed too long, too angular to be anything natural. It recoiled at the light, letting out a screech that cut through the night, a sound so unnatural it made my ears ring. I didn't wait around to see what it would do next. I turned and bolted, barely able to keep my footing on the uneven ground. The sound of snapping branches followed me, echoing in my head, each one driving me to run faster, harder. By the time I made it back to the station, my lungs were burning, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out. I slammed the door behind me, sinking to the floor, gasping for air. When I finally gathered the courage to look at myself, I noticed deep scratches on my jacket, as if something with claws had reached out and tried to grab me. And in the folds of the fabric, I found a single lock of hair, long, dark, and twisted, as if it had come from the creature itself. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I left something behind in those woods that night, or worse, that something out there wasn't finished with me. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, and part of me hopes I never will. All I know is that the forest feels different now, like it's watching, waiting, ready to pull me back in. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it, the soft, slow sound of branches snapping, dragging footsteps, echoing through the silence. Think you've heard it all? This next story will change that. I never believed in ghosts. That was something for kids or those who had too much time on their hands to think about. My life as a park ranger in the Rockies was grounded in reality, filled with the familiar sounds of nature, the crackle of a campfire, and the occasional laughter of hikers enjoying the vast wilderness. Yet, looking back now, I realize that belief is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the unknown. It was the autumn of 1987, and the mountain air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. I had just finished my morning rounds, checking the trails for fallen branches and making sure no campers had forgotten their gear. It was a routine I had grown accustomed to over the years, and today was no different. Until it was. The day had started out like any other, the sun peeking through a haze of clouds, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I decided to take a different trail, one that led along a steep cliffside, hoping for a moment of solitude amidst the serene beauty of the mountains. The path narrowed as I ventured deeper, the rocky ground crunching beneath my boots. I could hear the distant call of a hawk, the wind rustling through the trees, and the rhythmic sound of my own breathing. But as I descended further into the valley, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. It started as a shiver that ran down my spine, a warning from my instincts that something was off. Maybe it was the way the clouds had rolled in, thick and heavy, smothering the sun's warmth. Or perhaps it was the silence that seemed to swallow the natural sounds around me. Halfway down the trail, I noticed a silhouette near the cliff's edge. It stood unnaturally still, almost as if it were part of the landscape, an odd rock formation. At first, I thought it might be a lost hiker, so I called out, my voice breaking the eerie quiet, "Hey, you lost?" There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't even turn its head. My heart began to race and I felt a chill run through me. Instinctively, I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. Just as I did, the figure turned and vanished into the thickening mist. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. as if it had never existed at all. The quiet deepened around me, almost suffocating, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But curiosity held me in place. I hesitated, looking down into the fog-covered valley below, feeling as if I were teetering on the edge of something beyond my understanding. Taking a deep breath, I turned to head back up the trail. As I retraced my steps, the fog swirled around me, thicker than before, obscuring my view. The world felt altered, twisted. I felt like I was walking through a dream, each step taking me further away from reality. Just as I reached a bend in the path, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. The figure reappeared, this time closer than before. My heart dropped as I recognized it. A pale face with hollow, dark eyes staring directly at me. I could barely breathe as it opened its mouth, letting out a shrill, mournful wail that echoed through the cliffs, reverberating deep within my chest. The sound was otherworldly, a mix of pain and sorrow that seemed to pierce through the fog and settle into my bones. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I found myself frozen in place. The figure glided forward with an eerie grace, its presence drawing closer while I stumbled back, losing my footing on the edge of the trail. In a panic, I reached for my climbing rope, throwing it towards the figure, desperate to defend myself against whatever it was. The rope passed through it as if it were nothing more than smoke, causing the figure to fade momentarily, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. Scrambling back up the trail, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed myself forward, the feeling of dread washing over me like an icy wave. Finally, I reached a more stable area, panting heavily, every instinct urging me to get away from that place. But as I stood there, trembling, I could still hear that wail echoing through the canyons, haunting me. It was a sound that no one should ever have to hear, a cry of loss that lingered long after I had escaped. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure once more, but the mist had thickened, obscuring everything behind me. I made my way back to camp as quickly as I could, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs sending my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever had been on that cliffside was still there, lurking in the shadows. It was a feeling I had never experienced before, an unshakable fear that I couldn't rationalize away. For days after, I couldn't rid myself of the image of that figure, nor the mournful sound that echoed in my mind. I told my fellow rangers about it, but they dismissed it as my imagination, a trick of the fog. Yet deep down, I knew what I had seen and felt. Years later, I still hike those trails, but I avoid that particular path. Sometimes I hear whispers in the wind, or a distant wail that sends chills down my spine. Was it a lost hiker, a ghost of the mountain, or something else entirely? I may never know, but I carry that experience with me, a reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved. So if you ever find yourself hiking in the Rockies and hear something strange, if the mist thickens and the silence deepens, don't be too quick to brush it off. You might just encounter the cliffside wraith, watching, waiting, and forever haunting the mountains where reality blurs with the unknown. If you're feeling brave, stay with me, but the next story might make you regret it. People always seem to think I must have a million of them, given my job as a wildlife ranger, especially up here in Alaska, where nature can be as harsh as it is beautiful. But to be honest, most of the scary things I've seen are more about survival than anything supernatural. That was until last winter, when I encountered something I still can't explain. It started like any other day on patrol. My job was to document animal movements across a series of glaciers, record their habits, and note any signs of poaching or unusual behaviors. The higher-ups had recently assigned me a new route up the Coldridge Glacier, one of the loneliest spots in the region, tucked away far from the trails that even the most seasoned hikers would dare to follow. There, you're as likely to find another human as you are to stumble on a warm patch of ground in the middle of a blizzard. That morning, I geared up and headed out before dawn. The cold hit me like a wall, seeping through every crack in my gear, but I was used to it. It was a kind of peaceful isolation, the quiet that comes when there's nothing around but ice and the occasional low groan of the glacier shifting beneath your feet. Hours passed as I recorded tracks of wolves, the outline of a bear's paw imprinted in the snow, and a few birds who were somehow surviving out here. By noon, a thin layer of snow had started to fall, dusting the landscape in a fresh, clean sheet. That's when I saw it, the first sign that something was off. It was a set of tracks, though unlike any I'd seen before. They were deep, almost clawed, and spaced out too far apart for any animal I knew to be native to the area. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light or some kind of rock fall that had just happened to look like tracks. But when I brushed away the fresh snow, the marks were clearly deliberate. Each step pressed firmly into the icy ground. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed them, my hand hovering near the flare gun strapped to my side, a habit that rarely proved necessary but made me feel a little more secure. The tracks led toward a jagged opening in the glacier, a cave, half hidden behind a ledge of broken ice. The entrance was narrow, just wide enough for me to squeeze through if I dared, which, at the time, I did. I'll admit my heart raced as I crawled inside, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The air turned colder, so cold it burned with each breath. The cave went deeper than I expected, a twisting tunnel that seemed to close in around me. I almost turned back a few times, convincing myself I'd seen enough, but something kept drawing me forward. The faintest glint of light reflected off the walls ahead, almost like a trickle of water frozen mid-drip. And that's when I saw them. Scattered along the icy floor were animals, at least that's what they had been once. Foxes, birds, even a small caribou, frozen solid. Their eyes were wide open, staring into the empty space of the cave with expressions of sheer terror, as if something had stopped them in their tracks and left them forever suspended in fear. I was about to turn back when I felt it. A prickling sensation that crawled up my spine, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. My breath caught in my throat as I swung my flashlight around, illuminating the far corner of the cave. And there, barely visible against the ice, was something alive. Its body was translucent, like it had been sculpted from the very ice that surrounded it. Pale, empty eyes stared at me, reflecting the light in a way that made them seem to flicker, though it had no pupils, no real expression at all. The creature was hunched, limbs stretched awkwardly, as if it had been trying to meld itself into the walls, waiting. I stumbled back, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The creature tilted its head, moving slightly closer, its form shimmering with each shift. In a moment of sheer instinct, I reached for my flare gun and fired. The light of the flare burst into the cave, filling it with an eerie, reddish glow. For a split second, I saw the creature's face twist, an impossible shape that flickered like fire against the ice. Then, with a sound like cracking glass, it vanished, slipping back into the walls as if it had never been there. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I scrambled out of the cave, my hands numb and trembling as I forced myself up the icy slope and back toward camp. Every crunch of my boots in the snow felt too loud, too close, as if something was following me just beyond the light of my flashlight. I made it back to the ranger station hours later, exhausted and covered in a cold sweat. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, telling myself it must have been the cold or a trick of the light. But when I unpacked my gear, I found deep claw marks scratched into my backpack, the same pattern as the tracks I'd followed into the cave. I've since requested to be reassigned, and they put me on a new route far from Coldridge Glacier. I haven't told anyone else this story, and honestly, I'd rather believe it was all just a vivid nightmare. But I know one thing for certain. There's something waiting in that ice, something that's been there for centuries, watching, waiting, and someday it might just find what it's looking for. The last story was scary, but nothing compared to what you're about to hear. Eyes in the ice. The Alaskan wilderness is stunning and terrifying in equal measure. As a wildlife ranger, I've spent countless days wandering through its frozen expanses, documenting animal behaviors and tracking their movements across the glaciers. You get used to the eerie quiet, the sharp bite of the cold, and the creeping feeling that you're always just a little out of your depth in such an untamed place. Last winter, I was assigned a new route up the Coldridge Glacier, one of the loneliest areas I'd ever patrolled. It's tucked away from the paths that even seasoned hikers would attempt. A desolate stretch of ice and snow where you're as likely to find a warm patch of ground as you are to see another human being. I started my day before dawn, gearing up in layers to combat the chill that pressed in from all sides. With my trusty gear in tow, I set out, the world still cloaked in darkness. There was a stillness that morning, a serene quiet that felt almost sacred, interrupted only by the crunch of my boots on the hard snow. As I walked, I recorded the tracks I found, wolf prints etched into the powder, a few remnants of bird activity, and the occasional marks left by a bear. After hours of trekking, a thin layer of snow began to fall, dusting the landscape in a pristine cover. That's when I noticed something unusual. A set of tracks lay before me, unlike any I'd encountered in my years working in this region. They were deep and clawed, spaced out too far for any animal I could identify. For a moment, I thought it might just be a trick of the light, or a remnant of a rock slide. But brushing aside the fresh snow revealed unmistakable, deliberate marks etched into the ice. My curiosity piqued. I decided to follow them. As I walked, I kept my hand close to the flare gun strapped to my side, a habit that made me feel a bit more secure, even if it rarely proved necessary. The tracks led to a jagged opening in the glacier, an ice cave partially obscured by a ledge of shattered ice. The entrance was narrow, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment, the cold air rushing out like a warning, but my desire to uncover the mystery pushed me forward. With my flashlight in hand, I crawled inside, the walls of ice pressing in around me. The deeper I went, the colder it became, a biting chill that stunned my lungs with each breath. Just as I considered turning back, a glimmer of light caught my eye, reflecting off something deeper within the cave. That's when I saw them. Scattered across the icy ground lay the remains of various animals, foxes, birds, and even a small caribou, perfectly preserved in the ice. Their eyes stared into the void, frozen in expressions of sheer terror, as if the last moments of their lives had been trapped in time. I was about to retreat when a sudden chill washed over me. I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Heart pounding, I swung my flashlight toward the far corner of the cave, and what I saw made me freeze. A creature stood there, half hidden in the ice. Its body was translucent, as if formed from the very glacier surrounding it. Pale, empty eyes reflected the light in a disconcerting way, flickering as it moved. It was hunched over, its limbs contorted in an unnatural position, seemingly merging with the ice, waiting. I stumbled backward, panic surging through me. Instinct took over. I reached for my flare gun and fired it into the cave. The flare erupted into brilliant light, casting eerie shadows along the walls. For a brief moment, I saw the creature's face twist in a way that defied logic, a flickering image that danced with the flare's glow. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, it vanished into the ice, as if it had never existed. I didn't stop to catch my breath as I scrambled out of the cave, my hands trembling and numb from the cold. Every crunch of snow beneath my boots echoed like a warning, the feeling of something lingering just beyond the reach of my flashlight. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, hours had passed, and I was a mess of exhaustion and fear. As I unpacked my gear, I discovered deep claw marks scratched into my backpack, the same pattern I had seen in the snow. Since then, I've requested to be reassigned, and thankfully, they moved me to a different route, far from Coldridge Glacier. I haven't shared my experience with anyone else. It feels too strange, too unsettling. I'd rather convince myself it was just a vivid nightmare. But I know this for sure. There's something out there in the ice, something ancient that watches and waits, and someday it might find what it's looking for. Hold your breath, because the terror only deepens in the next tale. It was the summer of 1912, and I was a ranger up in the Oregon wilderness. Most days were predictable, filled with the routine of patrols, clearing trails, and occasionally warning the odd camper about bears. My name is Sam Crowley, and for the most part, I was a grizzled, no-nonsense man who didn't scare easy. I'd seen all manner of strange things out there, but one particular evening changed everything I thought I knew about those woods. My brother Jack had passed a few years back. We were close. He'd taught me everything about survival, the forest, and more importantly, how to keep my head in strange situations. I'd never admit it aloud, but I kept a little compass he'd given me when we were kids. It was battered and a bit rusty, but it was a keepsake. Some days, it felt like Jack was still guiding me through the thick and shadowy trees, especially when things got tense. That evening, I'd been doing a routine patrol as dusk settled over the pine forest. The fog was creeping in, and the sun had just about dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows between the trees. There's something about dusk that brings a strange, almost unnatural quiet to the forest. The birds stop chirping, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. As I walked, a low hum reached my ears, distant but consistent. It was odd, not like anything natural. It wasn't the sound of an engine, nor the hum of insects. It was as though the woods themselves were vibrating with something ominous and unseen. I kept walking, trying to brush off the unease when I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Sam?" It called, low and soft, like a whisper in the wind. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart began to pound as I turned slowly, looking for the source of the voice. It couldn't be. It sounded just like Jack. For a second, I was frozen in place, listening. The wind whistled through the trees, and for a moment there was silence. Then it came again, clearer this time. "Sam?" I clutched the compass in my hand, feeling its cold metal press into my palm. Logic told me it couldn't be Jack, but I couldn't shake the familiarity of that voice. My pulse quickened, and against my better judgment, I followed it, drawn to the source like a moth to a flame. The fog grew thicker as I walked, and the woods seemed darker, more sinister with each step. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange. The trees around me bore claw marks, deep and jagged, like something with powerful, razor-sharp talons had scraped against the bark. I crouched down, running my fingers along the fresh gouges. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, but I kept going, driven by some unseen force. The voice came again, closer now, calling my name in a low, mournful tone. But there was something off, something that sent a chill down my spine. The tone was almost too perfect, like it was trying to mimic Jack's voice but missing something, some unnameable essence that made it truly his. As I pushed forward, my hands trembling, a shadow emerged in the mist, tall and impossibly thin. It loomed between the trees, moving in unnatural jerks and starts, as though it was learning how to walk. Its limbs were elongated, and its eyes, those piercing yellow eyes, locked onto me from across the clearing, unblinking and cold. I gripped my hunting knife, feeling its reassuring weight in my hand. The creature moved closer, weaving between the trees with an eerie, deliberate grace. My breath caught in my throat. It let out a low, guttural sound, a growl that seemed to echo through the fog. The noise reverberated in my bones, making my skin crawl. The thing didn't charge. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I had nowhere to go. Its gaze was unrelenting, and the longer I looked, the more it felt like it was reaching into my mind, pulling memories of Jack and twisting them. I don't know what possessed me, but I swung the knife as it drew near, slicing the air between us. It recoiled for a moment, its yellow eyes narrowing. Then, with a sudden, unnatural speed, it lunged forward. I threw myself backward, stumbling and nearly losing my footing. Somehow, I managed to dodge its claws, feeling the rush of air as it swiped just inches from my face. In that moment, I acted on instinct. I hurled the knife at the creature and turned, running as fast as I could, the fog thickening around me. I didn't look back, not once. The sound of my own ragged breaths and the pounding of my heart filled my ears as I tore through the woods, desperate to escape. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the fog had lifted, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I stopped, panting, my legs shaking beneath me. I looked back, half expecting to see those yellow eyes watching me from the shadows, but there was nothing, just an empty forest, silent and still. I left that place soon after. I never went back to those woods. To this day, the memory of those eyes haunts me, a lingering fear that gnaws at the edges of my mind. Sometimes, in the early morning mist, I swear I can still feel them watching me, waiting, like a dark shadow hidden in the pines. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, this next story will prove you wrong. I don't tell this story often. Even my husband doesn't know the full details, though he's the one who had to deal with the aftermath, with me waking up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. It's strange how I've spent years dealing with nature's harsh realities, surviving winter storms, warning tourists about bears, and dragging injured hikers back down the mountains. But nothing I've been through before or since compares to that night. It was 1976, and I was stationed in the Appalachian Mountains, my usual summer assignment as a park ranger. It was lonely work, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the quiet, the solitude, and the challenge of keeping a careful eye on the land. I was in my early 30s, experienced enough to feel confident, but still sharp, maybe even a little too brave. I'd been through my share of strange encounters out there, but I'd always brushed them off, chalking things up to coincidence or people's imaginations. That's what I thought was happening this time, too. I was finishing up a routine patrol, one of those sticky summer evenings where the air barely moves and the crickets seem louder than ever. I'd been following a trail through a dense thicket when I noticed something a little out of place. A tent, old and a bit tattered, pitched far from any of the campsites. This area was way off trail, so it didn't make sense to find anyone there. I approached cautiously, calling out a friendly hello, just in case someone was inside. No answer. The tent looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in days. I unzipped the tent, half expecting to find a sleeping bag, maybe a pile of empty food wrappers. Instead, I found a small journal lying open on the floor. Flipping through it, I noticed erratic handwriting, like someone had been scribbling in a hurry. Most of the entries were typical. Descriptions of the weather, some complaints about blisters, notes on wildlife sightings. But as I reached the later entries, the tone shifted. The writer started describing a strange sound, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to drift through the trees at night. "It's beautiful," one entry read, "but there's something off about it. I thought it was a bird at first, but now I'm not so sure." The last entry was scrawled in a messy, almost illegible script. I followed it. Couldn't help myself. The song is pulling me. If someone finds this, be careful. Don't listen. A chill crept up my spine as I read those words. I'd read enough to know how isolation could mess with someone's mind, especially out here, where there's no one to keep you grounded. "It's just a story," I told myself, leaving the journal where I'd found it. But something about it gnawed at me. The idea of a song drawing someone off trail, it sounded ridiculous, but also possible. That night, I set up my own tent by a small stream a couple of miles away, just close enough to hear the water trickling over rocks, which usually helped me sleep. I had my dog Hank with me, a big, loyal mutt who'd followed me on countless hikes. He was my only company out there, and I trusted him to warn me if anything was nearby. I lay down, trying to brush off the journal entry as a strange story, maybe a prank or some creative way to pass the time. But just as I was drifting off, Hank perked up, his ears twitching. I could feel him tense, his whole body alert. And then, through the trees, I heard it. A song. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the stream, but it was there. A melody, soft and slow, drifting through the trees like smoke. It was strangely beautiful, almost like a lullaby, but with a note of sadness that sent a chill through me. I sat up, straining to listen, my heart pounding. Hank growled softly, his gaze fixed on something in the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just an owl or a coyote, anything that made sense. But the song didn't stop. It grew louder, like it was getting closer, wrapping itself around me, making it hard to think about anything else. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, moving toward the sound. Hank barked, trying to block my path, but I nudged him aside. The melody seemed to be pulling me forward, and I couldn't resist. It was like I was in a trance, my legs moving of their own accord, leading me into the woods. The trees seemed darker, taller, their branches twisting together overhead. The song was louder now, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, just ahead, I saw something. An outline, barely visible in the shadows. It looked like a man, but something about him wasn't right. His eyes caught the light in an unnatural way, and his fingers, they were long, too long, reaching out toward me as if they were stretching. Hank barked, snapping me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and turned to run, dragging Hank with me. But as we ran, the song followed us, echoing through the trees, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I didn't stop running until I reached my tent, slamming the zipper shut behind me, as if that could keep whatever it was out. The song faded, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. But I knew I wasn't alone out there anymore, and I'd never be, not really. That melody, that haunting, beautiful song, it stayed with me. I can still hear it sometimes in my dreams, calling me back to those woods. If you thought the last story was creepy, brace yourself. This one is even darker. It's hard to explain what happened to me back in '85. I've tried to tell people about it, but no one really believes me. Maybe I can't blame them. It's easier to dismiss things like this as tall tales, stories to scare people around a campfire. But it happened. I know it did. And no matter how many winters I've patrolled these mountains since, I still think about that night. Let me start from the beginning. It was a typical January night in Denali National Park. I was on a solo patrol, making my rounds along the slopes, checking the campsites, and ensuring no one was out there caught in the storm. The cold was biting, the wind cutting through every layer of clothing, but I was used to it. Winter up there is unforgiving, and you learn to respect it. That night, though, felt different. The silence was almost too thick, as if the entire world had gone still. As I trekked through the snow, I noticed a faint glow off in the distance. It was strange. I'd been over this part of the mountain many times, and there were no cabins, no camps, nothing that should have been there. Yet there it was, a single light, flickering, about half a mile away. I figured it might be a camper in trouble or someone who'd gotten lost. So I started toward it, gripping my flashlight and radio tightly. The snow was knee-deep, and every step felt like a fight against the wind. I struggled through, and as I got closer, I could make out the shape of a cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and gray, half buried in the snow like it had been there forever. The thing was, I knew the park like the back of my hand, and I was certain there hadn't been any cabins up here, especially not one that looked like it had been here for ages. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, my breath fogging up in the cold air. It was warm. Warmer than it should have been, given the weather and the state of the place. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The walls were rough, beams of wood that seemed ready to splinter with a touch. There was an old stove in the corner, with a thin, dying flame. That's when I noticed the carvings on the walls. Odd symbols, almost like letters, but not in any language I knew. Then, I saw it. A single photograph lying on a small, rickety table. I picked it up, brushing off the dust. It was a faded picture of a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, dressed in clothes from another era. The kind kids wore in the 1800s. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and he was staring straight at the camera. There was something wrong with his expression, something too knowing, almost like he could see through the photo. I don't know how to explain it, but it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. The force of it made me jump, and I whipped around, my heart racing. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone, or something, was holding it closed from the outside. The wind picked up, howling around the cabin like a wild animal, and I heard a faint scraping sound near the window. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and in the dim light, I thought I saw something move outside. I froze, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. There, peering in through the window, was a face. Pale as snow, with hollow, sunken eyes and a childlike expression that didn't match the twisted grin stretching across its face. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. I fumbled for my radio, but the static was too loud, crackling with every button press. All I could hear was that awful grating noise. I tried the door again, but it was as if it was bolted shut from the outside. The scratching continued, the sound crawling up and down the window. I felt trapped, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. I had to get out, but the only way was through that door, or a window. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing myself to break the glass if I had to. Then, as quickly as it started, everything went silent. The scratching stopped, the wind died down, and the figure at the window was gone. I stood there, breathless, waiting for something, anything to happen. The door creaked open by itself. I didn't question it. I grabbed the photo, stuffing it in my jacket pocket without really thinking, and bolted out into the night. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew I had to get as far away from that cabin as possible. I ran, stumbling through the snow, my legs burning with every step. But no matter how fast I moved, I felt like something was following me, watching me. After what felt like hours, I collapsed, gasping for air, my face stinging from the cold. The storm had picked up again, and I could barely see my own hands in front of me. I closed my eyes, too exhausted to keep going, letting the snow and wind bury me. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard voices calling my name. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a rescue vehicle, a team of rangers around me. They'd found me, nearly frozen, barely coherent. But all I could think about was that photo, the one I'd shoved into my pocket. I reached for it, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. There it was, damp from the snow but real as anything. The boy's eyes stared back at me, dark and hollow, his face twisted into that same eerie grin. To this day, I still have that photograph, hidden away in a box at home. I've thought about burning it, throwing it away, anything to get rid of it. But every time I try, I feel a cold draft sweep through my house, and I stop myself. The cabin? I've tried finding it again, going back up that mountain in daylight, combing every part of that slope. But there's nothing there, no trace of it, not even an old foundation or scrap of wood. It's as if the cabin, and whatever was inside it, never existed. But I know it did. And every winter, when the wind starts to howl and the snow piles up outside my window, I feel that same chill. It's a reminder, a warning maybe, of what's still out there, waiting in the cold. That was just the beginning. The true horror lies in what's coming next. I'll never forget the summer of 1993, and I doubt anyone who was there with me will either. I'd been working as a ranger at Zion National Park for a little over a year. The work was routine but fulfilling, mostly making sure hikers didn't wander off the trails, checking camping permits, and occasionally helping with minor first aid. My background as a paramedic made me a perfect fit for the emergency side of things, so I got called in for every search and rescue mission. It was a peaceful life, usually, until the day I was sent into the canyon. That morning started like any other. I was making my rounds, checking in with campers, and making sure they were following the fire safety guidelines, when I got a call on the radio. There'd been a rock slide in one of the remote canyons, a part of the park that was rarely visited due to its narrow and winding paths. No one was supposed to be in that area, but there was always a chance someone had ignored the signs and wandered off trail. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rock slides happen, especially in narrow canyons where the wind and water wear down the stone. The only unsettling thing was how sudden it had been. The last time anyone checked that part of the canyon, the rocks were stable. I packed up my gear, called for backup, and headed out with a small team. There were 4 of us, me, 2 other rangers, and a volunteer who'd just started training. As we walked along the narrow canyon trail, everything felt eerily silent. No birds, no wind, not even the usual rustling of small animals, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and gravel. The deeper we got, the more unsettling things became. About halfway through, we found a pile of bones, animal bones, scattered along the path. Now, this wasn't unheard of. Wild animals roamed these parts, and sometimes a predator would leave behind the remains of its meal. But there was something off about this pile. The bones were arranged almost deliberately, stacked in a rough spiral. My teammate Mark looked at me, his face pale. "Looks like someone's idea of a sick joke," he muttered, but there was no humor in his voice. We pressed on, brushing it off as some camper's prank, though we all felt a bit uneasy. The shadows grew longer as the day wore on, and I felt this creeping sense that we were being watched. Every now and then I'd hear a sound, a faint crunch, a soft whisper of something shifting behind us, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, we'd reached the site of the rock slide. It was strange, though. The rocks didn't look like they'd fallen from above. Instead, they were scattered around like they'd been tossed, as if something had erupted from within the canyon walls. As we inspected the area, something caught my eye. Markings scratched into the rock. I leaned closer and ran my fingers over them. They were rough, jagged lines forming shapes that I didn't recognize. Somewhere between symbols and claw marks, scattered along the wall in a chaotic pattern. We decided to split up slightly to cover more ground, each taking one side of the narrow path. The rookie stayed with me as we moved along, calling out every so often to see if anyone answered. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on us like a weight. And then I heard it, faint, echoing off the canyon walls, a voice, my own voice, calling out my name. "Mia!" I froze, my heart pounding. The rookie beside me gave me a nervous glance, but I forced myself to shrug it off. "It's just an echo," I said, trying to reassure him as much as myself. But deep down, I knew echoes didn't work like that. The voice called again, but it sounded wrong. Hollow, stretched, like something was forcing the words through a mouth that wasn't made for them. The rookie's face had gone pale, and he was clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. "Mia, help me." The voice sounded closer now, almost directly behind us. We spun around, shining our flashlights into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the narrow walls of the canyon, closing in like a vice. I forced myself to take a step forward, but then I saw it. Just at the edge of the flashlight beam, something shifted. A form that looked almost like a person, hunched and twisted, its skin gray and stone-like, blending perfectly with the canyon walls. Its eyes were hollow pits, and as I stared, it seemed to meld with the rock, vanishing into the shadows. "Run!" I barely managed to get the word out before we took off down the path, our footsteps echoing wildly. The creature's voice, my own voice, followed us, calling out with an eerie calmness that made my skin crawl. When we finally burst out of the canyon, the sunlight felt like a miracle. We collapsed, gasping, our hearts racing. The other 2 team members were already waiting at the entrance, pale and shaken. They had heard it too. The voice, calling out, mimicking each of us in turn. None of us spoke on the hike back to the ranger station. The next few weeks passed in a blur. We reported what happened, but no one really believed us. They thought it was the stress of the job, or that we'd let our imaginations get the best of us. But every so often, a hiker would report strange echoes in the canyon, voices calling out to them by name. I never went back there. None of us did. And sometimes late at night, I'd hear it again. My own voice, whispering from the shadows, calling me back to the canyon. If you manage to keep your eyes open so far, good luck. The next story is even scarier. I still remember that evening like it happened yesterday, though it's been over 20 years. I was a park ranger in the Louisiana Bayou back then, responsible for patrolling areas dense with trees, marshes, and winding trails that felt endless. The air always hung thick with the scent of moss and wet earth, but that day it was different. That day I could smell blood. It was close to sunset. My dog Buck, a loyal bloodhound who'd been with me for years, walked by my side, his nose occasionally dipping to the ground to sniff out any unfamiliar scent. We'd been out there all afternoon, checking on some traps that had been tampered with. It wasn't unusual for folks to wander in and mess with the traps, so I wasn't worried, until that smell hit me. At first, I thought maybe a deer had been injured nearby. The bayou was full of wildlife, and sometimes predators got to them before we even knew they were there. But as we continued, the smell got stronger, sharper, until it seemed to surround us. Buck started growling. That was my first clue that this wasn't just some injured animal. He never growled like that unless there was a real threat around, something we both needed to watch for. I followed the scent, pushing through thick brush, stepping over gnarled roots and tangled vines. And then I saw it, a small clearing with bits of fur and feathers scattered everywhere, shredded like some beast had torn through it in a frenzy. My gut twisted. There was no natural predator in the bayou that could make that kind of mess. The animals, they looked wrong. Torn apart and left there, like something had taken pleasure in the act. Before I could fully process it, Buck let out a low, guttural growl, his hackles raised, eyes fixed on something just beyond the clearing. I squinted into the shadows, straining to see what he saw. And then, just barely visible between the trees, I noticed movement. It was a figure, hunched and still, half hidden in the mud and shadows, its skin mottled and peeling as if it had been left to rot in the sun. But it wasn't dead. Its head tilted slowly, watching me, studying me, like it was deciding something. I felt my heart pound against my ribs. I'm not someone who scares easily. Years in the bayou taught me how to handle all kinds of animals, dangerous or not. But this was something else. I took a step back, trying not to break eye contact, hoping that if I just moved slow enough, it wouldn't attack. But then it moved. Not towards me, but mirroring me, like it was mimicking my movements. I took another step, and it did too, shifting with a strange, jerky grace that sent a chill through me. Buck barked, snapping me out of my trance, and without thinking, I turned and bolted. The swamp felt like it was closing in on us. Every path twisted back on itself, every tree looked like the last. I'd spent my life in these woods, but that night, I couldn't find my way out. I stumbled through thick mud and over fallen branches, hearing my own ragged breath mix with Buck's heavy panting beside me. But behind us, always just a step out of sight, I could hear it moving, following, stalking. Buck stopped abruptly, looking back over his shoulder, and then he let out a yelp, a horrible, strangled sound I'd never heard from him before. I looked back, just for a second, and saw those eyes, bloodshot, glaring, fixed on me like I was its next meal. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, and I found myself at the edge of the river. Without thinking, I jumped, diving into the murky water and letting the current pull me downstream. I didn't care where it took me, as long as it was far from there. When I finally dragged myself onto the bank, gasping and soaked, I looked around, hoping against hope that Buck had made it out too. But he didn't. I searched for him for days after, but I never found a trace. And that thing? It was gone too, like it had never been there at all. But sometimes when the air is just right, I catch that scent again. That sharp, metallic smell of blood that takes me back to that night. And in those moments, I can almost feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting. The fear was only warming up. In the next story, it comes full force. I didn't believe in supernatural stories, not until the fall of 2015 anyway. Back then, I was a park ranger stationed at Olympic National Park. It's a job I loved, and I'd always considered the forests and mountains to be my second home. People tend to talk about the beauty of nature, the peacefulness of the trees and the rivers, but the wilderness has a different side too, a side that's darker and at times deeply unsettling. It all began in October during a particularly foggy stretch. Fog wasn't unusual for the Pacific Northwest, but this time it seemed denser, lingering throughout the day and settling heavily around the park. There were complaints from hikers who felt lost or disoriented, and one family even claimed to have seen something unusual in the mist. They talked about a shadow moving around the trees, but I brushed it off as paranoia and an overactive imagination. But then the reports started piling up, and my supervisor finally asked me to investigate. I remember thinking it would be a simple patrol, just a walk in the fog to reassure people that nothing was amiss. The day I went in, the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen. It felt like a wall, blanketing everything, and the air was damp and still. I carried my flashlight and wore my night vision goggles just in case, even though I didn't expect to need them during the day. For the first hour, I didn't notice anything unusual, just trees looming in the mist, the occasional rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird. Then I heard it, a strange, low sound. It wasn't an animal noise I recognized. It was a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled across the forest floor. I stopped and listened. My heart began to race as the sound drew closer, then stopped. I called out, thinking it might be a hiker needing help, but there was no response. Just silence. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, an instinctive reaction telling me that I wasn't alone. I turned on my night vision goggles, but they flickered, then went out completely. A strange glitch, I thought, though they'd always worked fine before. The fog made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction, so I took a few steps forward, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the mist, but it didn't disappear. It just stood there, watching. I felt frozen, and for a moment I couldn't move. My mind raced, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out of there. Slowly, I started backing away, keeping my eyes on the figure. It didn't move at first, but as I took another step, it began to follow. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it was dragging itself forward, yet somehow closing the distance. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I knew the forest well enough to understand that running blind would be a mistake. So I moved carefully, feeling my way along the familiar path, hoping it would give up and fade back into the mist. But it didn't. As I moved, it followed, staying just at the edge of my vision. And then I noticed something even stranger. The sounds. They were soft at first, animal calls, or what I thought were animal calls. A bird here, a wolf's howl there. But as I listened, I realized they weren't quite right. The sounds seemed to mimic animals, but they were distorted, hollow, as if someone or something was trying to imitate them but didn't fully understand how. By now, my sense of direction was gone, and the fog felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I could see the figure now, closer, its long limbs reaching out toward me as it mimicked a low, guttural growl. In a panic, I reached into my bag and pulled out my lighter and some paper scraps. I set them on fire, hoping the light would keep it at bay. The flames flared up, casting an eerie glow around me, and for a moment the figure hesitated, retreating just enough for me to turn and run. I didn't stop running until I broke through the fog and reached the ranger station. I was out of breath, shaking, but safe. I looked back, expecting to see the figure still there, watching me, but the mist had swallowed everything. I reported what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to stress, to fatigue, to too many hours spent alone in the woods. But a week later, I returned to the same spot, compelled by some strange need to see if it was real. There, on the trees along the path I'd taken, were deep claw marks, fresh and jagged, as if something had dragged its fingers across the bark. I left the park soon after. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen that day was still out there, waiting, watching, and marking the path, as if it expected me to come back. I never did. And even now, years later, I can still hear those hollow, distorted animal calls in my nightmares, and feel the cold, damp mist pressing against my skin. I'll never know what I saw that day, but I know one thing. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong, and it's waiting. Think that was the worst part? Then you're in for a terrifying surprise. They call it the Gorge, but really, it was just a narrow valley wedged between two mountains in the Rockies, blanketed with dense evergreens and lined with craggy outcroppings. Nothing like what you'd imagine a gorge to be. It was more like a twisted path carved by nature over millennia, and only a few people knew about it. Fewer still traveled there regularly. As a park ranger, I was one of those few. I'm Nadia Gupta, a ranger in my late 30s, a former firefighter, and just one step away from leaving this place. I was set for back surgery that I'd needed for years, and my plan was to retire to a quieter life afterward. But first, I wanted to do one last patrol through the gorge. It was more than just a job to me. I'd spent enough years out here to feel like I knew every tree, rock, and hidden animal track. I never expected what would happen on that last patrol. The day started out like any other. It was early September, and the air was just beginning to cool, the sky tinged with soft orange as I left the station. The weather had been finicky lately, with sporadic patches of fog that seemed to settle in places it didn't belong. It felt like the mountains themselves were sighing, making room for the oncoming winter. As I entered the trail, I heard the usual forest sounds, a woodpecker hammering in the distance, the rustle of squirrels, the light crackle of dry leaves underfoot. But then, maybe an hour into the patrol, I stumbled across someone who shouldn't have been there. He was a hiker, probably around 25, with a nasty gash on his leg. He looked exhausted, his face pale under a layer of dirt. He was limping heavily, clearly lost and injured. I introduced myself and offered to help him back. He didn't tell me much, just that he had gotten separated from his friends a day before. The wound didn't look too fresh, and I could tell he'd been wandering for hours, maybe even overnight. The two of us began the slow journey back, and for the first hour or so, it was uneventful. I kept an eye on him, making small talk to keep his spirits up, and he responded in short, exhausted bursts. Everything seemed normal, until we hit the silent patch. I can't explain it fully. It was just a part of the forest that suddenly felt off. The usual chirps and clicks of wildlife faded, until there was just the sound of our boots hitting the dirt. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I felt my heart skip. I had been out here hundreds of times, but I'd never experienced anything like this. A sudden dead quiet, like the whole place was holding a secret it didn't want to share. My companion noticed it too. He looked at me, his eyes wide and nervous, and I could see he was hoping I'd explain it away. But I didn't know what to say. All I could think was keep moving. The silence pressed down on us as we continued down the trail, both of us more alert, our steps quicker. I was looking over my shoulder every few minutes, a sense of unease clawing at me. Then came the shadow. It was a flicker at first, something dark in the corner of my eye. I turned, but it was gone, leaving only a faint shiver in the air. The hiker was looking in the same direction, his face pale, so I knew I wasn't just seeing things. We exchanged a nervous glance, and he whispered, "Did you see that?" I nodded, but didn't respond. I didn't want to feed his fear or mine. "Let's keep moving," I said, pushing forward, my hands clenched into fists. But it wasn't going to let us go that easily. We hadn't gone far when it appeared again, this time directly on the trail in front of us. It was a shadow, but not like any shadow I'd ever seen, solid, with hollow, gaping holes where eyes should be. Its shape was vaguely human, but distorted, like someone had taken an image and stretched it out. The hiker gasped and stumbled back, clutching at my arm. "What is that?" I didn't answer, because I had no answer. The thing stared at us, those empty eyes somehow drilling into me, even though they were nothing but voids. Then, without a sound, it vanished. But before we could even take a breath, it was there again, closer this time. "Run," I whispered, tugging the hiker along. We broke into a sprint, my back flaring with pain, but I pushed through it, knowing we had to get out of that silent patch. Behind us I could sense it, feel it, like a cold breath on my neck. Every time I looked back, it was closer, as if it was phasing in and out of reality, each time moving closer to us. "Keep going," I urged the hiker, though my own legs were screaming at me to stop. We dodged branches and stumbled over rocks, the forest spinning around us. I could barely hear my own breathing over the deafening silence. And then I realized it wasn't after me, it was after him. He was falling behind, the gash on his leg slowing him down, and the thing was closing in. I could feel its focus shift, a magnetic pull in the air between it and the hiker. Without thinking, I stopped and turned to face it, positioning myself between him and the shadow. "Go!" I shouted at him, shoving him forward. He hesitated for a moment, but then he took off, limping and stumbling down the trail. The shadow advanced on me, its empty eyes locking onto mine. I felt a chill seep into my bones, and I knew that whatever this thing was, it was beyond anything I'd ever encountered. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it had to do with him. I stood my ground, hoping that somehow by facing it, I could buy him time. The shadow loomed closer, its hollow eyes seeming to widen, its form flickering in and out of focus. I could feel its pull, like it was drawing me into those dark, empty spaces. And then nothing. I don't remember anything after that. When I came to, it was hours later, and I was lying on the trail alone. My pack was gone, my radio shattered nearby. There was no sign of the hiker, no sign of the shadow. But carved into the rock beside me, deep gouges that hadn't been there before, was a single word: leave. I stumbled my way back to the station in a daze, too weak and shaken to fully comprehend what had happened. They found the hiker, hours later, wandering near the park entrance, his leg wound miraculously healed. But he remembered nothing, only that he had been lost and then, somehow, he was safe. I filed my report, told them what I could, but I left out the part about the shadow, about the word carved into the stone. Who would believe me? Even now, years later, I can still feel that chill. The memory of those hollow eyes haunts me, like an unanswered question in the back of my mind. I never went back to the gorge, and I never will. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I feel it, like a shadow just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, watching, and I wonder if one day it will come back, looking for something it never found. Take a deep breath, because what comes next may leave you gasping for air. They tell you, when you sign up for a job like this, that it's a lot of solitude. They warn you about the isolation, the hours spent in a world that only you inhabit. I didn't mind that part. After all, I used to spend long days in an office, listening to people's struggles as a psychologist. The forest was meant to be a peaceful break from those years. So I took on the position of a ranger in the wilderness of northern Canada, far from the office walls and therapy couches, with only the calls of nature to keep me company. Or so I thought. It was late autumn, a time when the forest around here grew darker, more ominous. Even the birds were quieter, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. That day, I was out on a wildlife survey, a standard patrol meant to document any signs of bears, moose, or, if I was lucky, the elusive wolves. Nothing out of the ordinary at first. Just a chill in the air and an overcast sky stretching above me. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed how still everything was. No rustle of animals, no distant caws of crows, just an unnerving silence that wrapped around me. And then in the quiet, I heard something, a faint laugh. It was so distant that at first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a memory surfacing. But the laugh continued, echoing through the trees, bouncing back and forth as if the forest itself was alive with it. I stopped and turned, half expecting to see someone behind me. But I was alone. I called out, "Hello?" expecting my voice to fade into the trees. Instead, the word echoed back to me, but with a slight delay and an odd, mocking tone. I could almost hear a sneer in it, like someone repeating my words with twisted amusement. I shook it off, continuing my survey, trying to focus on my task. But that laugh, it followed me. Sometimes it was faint, sometimes it was closer, almost like it was whispering right next to my ear. And here's the part that really started to get to me. The laugh wasn't just any laugh, it was mine. I felt my skin prickle. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get out of there, but curiosity pulled me forward. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, repeating logical explanations in my head. Maybe it was an echo bouncing off the hills or the wind carrying sounds from somewhere I couldn't see. But with each step, my confidence wore thinner, replaced by a gnawing fear. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, almost like it was dodging my gaze. I told myself it was probably a deer or a wolf, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It moved too fluidly, too intelligently, slipping between shadows, blending with the bark of the trees. My heart pounded as I followed the movement with my eyes, unable to make out any real shape. I gripped my flashlight, though it was still broad daylight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. No answer. Only silence. And then my voice repeating back to me in that same twisted, mocking tone. "Who's there?" A chill ran down my spine. It was as if the forest itself was taunting me, throwing my own words back with a distorted edge. I took a step back, feeling that overwhelming urge to leave, to run. But when I turned around, the shadow was there, blocking my path. It was close enough now that I could see it more clearly, a dark, shifting form that seemed to mirror my own movements. Every step I took, it would take 1-2 in perfect sync. I tried to sidestep, to trick it, but it moved with me. No matter which way I turned, it blocked me, like it was playing a game, daring me to make the first move. My mind raced through survival strategies, but each idea seemed pointless. This wasn't something I'd learned about in any guidebook. In a desperate, panicked move, I turned and sprinted, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. I didn't care about my survey, my job, or even the fact that I might get lost. I just needed to get away from that thing. I heard my own laughter following me, louder and more twisted, echoing through the trees. It felt like the forest itself was closing in, mocking me with every step. Somehow, I made it back to the station, panting, my body aching. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, as if a simple lock could keep out whatever that was. But when I finally gathered the courage to look out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Right there, on the edge of the forest, a single tree had a mark carved into it. My name, deeply etched into the bark, as if it had been there all along, waiting for me. Even now, I can't explain what happened that day. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes when I'm alone, I hear it. That laugh, faint and distant, like an echo that never truly fades. If that sent shivers down your spine, brace yourself for what's coming next. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghost stories. After years in the military, you learn to see things for what they are. Nature is brutal, but it doesn't have a mind for mischief. Animals, storms, terrain, everything follows rules. Or at least, that's what I thought. I had taken the ranger job in South Dakota as a way to get some peace after my years of service. They stationed me in an area called Black Elk Ridge, an isolated stretch of hills in the southwestern part of the state. The hills were sprawling, quiet, and beautiful, with fields that turned golden in the summer and forests thick with pine and aspen. But locals had a different name for the place, the Howling Hills. I'd heard the stories, the muttered warnings from some of the older folks around town, but I brushed it off. It was just another local legend, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. My work was mostly routine, making sure trails were clear, keeping an eye on wildlife, and guiding the occasional lost hiker back to the main road. One quiet afternoon, I was sitting in the small ranger station when the phone rang. It was dispatch telling me that folks had been reporting strange noises up in the hills. They said it sounded like some kind of animal, but nothing anyone could recognize. Normally, I'd pass it off as coyotes or mountain lions, but there was something in the dispatcher's voice that made me uneasy. Curious, I grabbed my gear, loaded up the truck, and set off up the narrow, winding road that led into the hills. The late summer sky was heavy with clouds, and as I drove, I noticed the wind picking up, making the trees sway. South Dakota wasn't known for big storms, but there was something about the air that felt electric. I parked at the trailhead and stepped out. Silence, except for the wind whistling through the trees. I took my flashlight and radio and started along the trail, my boots crunching on the dry ground. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of branches. Then I heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to roll over the hills like a wave. I stopped, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. A coyote, I thought, or maybe a wolf. But as I kept listening, the howl changed, growing deeper, almost layered, like several voices echoing over each other. I shook off the chill creeping up my spine and kept walking. The trail wound higher, and soon I found myself in a dense patch of forest, the trees blocking out what little sunlight remained. I was just starting to feel uneasy when I heard it again, a howling, this time closer and more distinct. It was coming from up ahead, echoing off the trees. My heart pounded as I tried to remind myself it was just an animal. I dealt with worse. The path took a sharp turn, and I froze. There, in a small clearing, stood a creature that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was massive, standing on four thin, almost ghostly legs, covered in fur so dark it seemed to absorb the fading light. But what made my blood run cold were its eyes. Dozens of them, scattered across its face like droplets of water. They blinked, one by one, each eye fixed on me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, as if on cue, a flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. The creature let out a howl that reverberated through my chest, making it hard to tell which direction it was coming from. I scrambled to reach my radio, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Kessler. I need backup. I don't know what I'm looking at, but it's not normal." My voice sounded small, shaky, even to me. The radio crackled, and I caught a broken reply. Something about 2 other rangers being sent out. But the storm had rolled in so quickly, and the rain began pouring down, soaking me within seconds and making it nearly impossible to see. The lightning flashed again, and for a moment I saw the creature moving, weaving through the trees in a way that seemed almost deliberate, calculated. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My legs just took over, carrying me back down the trail. I could hear it behind me, the low, echoing howl bouncing off the trees, disorienting me. Every time I thought I'd gained some distance, I'd hear it again, closer. My GPS had failed, the screen a scrambled mess of static, and the rain had turned the trail to mud. I slipped, falling hard, but fear drove me to my feet, and I kept running. I don't know how long I ran. By the time I made it back to the truck, my lungs were burning and my clothes were drenched. I jumped inside, slammed the door, and fumbled with the keys. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The drive back to the station was a blur, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I finally pulled in, I saw the other rangers waiting, their faces pale. They asked what happened, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just shook my head, still hearing the echoes of that howl in my mind. Days passed, but the howling didn't stop. Locals said it grew louder, like the hills themselves were alive with some ancient, unspoken warning. And when I finally told my superiors what I'd seen, they didn't believe me. Said it was a bear, or maybe a trick of the light brought on by the storm. But I know what I saw. And every time I close my eyes, I see those dozens of eyes staring back at me. Feel that low, haunting howl reverberate through my chest. The howling hills haven't let go of me yet, and if the stories are true, they never will.